In the past, the rabbi has described the pronunciation of the vowel known as Kamatz as being between the patach and the cholem. Some have asked, what are the rabbi's sources for making this claim?
Let us begin at the beginning. We have the explicit statement of one of the greatest medaktakim, one of the greatest grammarians, experts in the Hebrew language, Hebrew grammar, also one of the greatest mefarshim, commentators on the Tanakh, on the Bible, namely Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, and he wrote a number of books on Dikduk, on Hebrew grammar. One of them is called Sefer Sahuth, and at the beginning of that book he writes as follows. On page 3 of that book he writes as follows, I quote, Da, no, ki tenu'ath ha-chames ha-gadol, the tenu'ah, the vowel known as the chames ha-gadol, the big or large or major, strong chames, even though it's often pronounced kamas nowadays, but in all the ancient sources the name of the vowel is chames. He says, you should know that this vowel, murkeveth mi holem or mi patah gadol. The name of that nu'ah, the o, the vowel, the o, is also often nowadays called a holam, but in all ancient works it is referred to as a holem. Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra says explicitly that the chames is a vowel sound which is in fact two vowel sounds, or somewhere in between two vowel sounds, namely that of the holem, which is the o vowel sound, and the patah gadol, which is the a sound. He refers to what we normally refer to as the patah, the a, the vowel sound a. He refers to it as a patah gadol because he, the Ibn Ezra, as Rashi does as well, and others, refer to what we normally refer to as the segol as a patah katan, which is a separate discussion. But at any rate, it's clear that the Ibn Ezra is referring to the patah on the one hand, and the holem, the o, on the other hand, the a and the o. And he states explicitly that the chames is a vowel sound which is actually murkeveth, is made up of both these sounds. That is to say, it is halfway between, or somewhere between these two vowel sounds. And he goes on to say, al ken, therefore, suratho kesurat shenehem, and therefore the graphic representation of that vowel, the chames, is made up of those two other, the representations of those other two vowels. And what he means to say is this: the graphic symbol that is written or printed to represent the patah, the vowel patah, which is an a sound, is a straight line, a straight horizontal, small horizontal line under the letter. The graphic symbol that is printed or written for the o, the vowel known as the holem, the o, is a dot on top of that letter. And what Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra is telling us is that the symbol for the chames, which he has just explained to us, is a combination of, or some kind of midway vowel sound between the holem, the o, and the patah, the a, is made up of these two symbols in order to indicate this very fact. That is to say, it is made up of the straight line, the patah, and nowadays usually it's represented, the chames is represented by another short line under that horizontal line, a vertical line under the horizontal line, so it looks a bit like a small T. But in fact, originally it wasn't written that way, it was not represented that way, it was represented as a straight horizontal line which represents the patah, and a small dot under the touching and directly under the horizontal line representing the patah, and that dot represents the holem, because the holem is just a dot above the letter. So if you have a horizontal line and you have a small dot, something visible, or let's say a very, very tiny line, vertically speaking, under that horizontal line, you have a representation of these two vowels. You have the patah and you have the holem directly under it, touching it, so it forms something like a T, so to speak, and that's why eventually it was represented more often than not by a line and a dot, but by two lines. And by explaining this, Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra is telling us that the Kamatz is in fact a vowel sound which is somewhere between these two vowel sounds, between the O and the A. And he goes on to say the correct pronunciation of the Kamatz, he says, "Eno pathuach kefathach gadol kasher nachnu koreim otho bimkomot ha'ele." It is not the same sound, the same vowel sound as the A, the pathah, as we read it in this part of the world. So says Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. He's referring without doubt to Spain, and possibly to other countries that he visited where the pronunciation was as it was in Spain, that is to say where the Kamatz was pronounced as if it were the same as a patah, which is the Sfaradi pronunciation to this day. He says, "Rak anshe Tveria, gam hachmem Misraim wa Africa yodaim likro hakamas hagadol." In fact, he says there are not that many Jews nowadays, and we have to remember that we're talking here about almost 900 years ago. Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra testifies to the fact that the correct pronunciation of the vowel, the Kamatz, even in his day, was not known by most Jews, or had been forgotten, or had somehow become distorted in the way that it was pronounced by most Jews in most communities. And he says only some Jews, or the Jews in Tveria, which is the famous town in the north of Eretz Yisrael, in the north of Israel, which was a great center of biblical and Hebrew studies. He says only those people in Tveria, and also Hachme Misraim wa Africa, and also the knowledgeable scholars in Misraim, in Egypt, and in North Africa, only they know how to pronounce the Kamatz properly. From these few words of Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, who again is one of the very greatest authorities in all things to do with Lashon HaKodesh, with the Hebrew language, with the Holy Tongue. From these few words that he writes in his book Sefer Sahut, we can learn and know several important facts. First of all, the basic claim, the statement, the unequivocal statement. He doesn't state it as an opinion. He says that this is how it is to be pronounced. The Kamatz is a vowel sound which is somewhere between the A of the Pathach and the O of the Holim, which I will try and demonstrate that in a moment. Second of all, he points out that already in his day, roughly 900 years ago, most Jews were no longer fully conversant with this vowel sound. Most of them were not pronouncing it correctly. It also, therefore, follows from what Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra states, that the pronunciation of the Kamatz is not an A, nor is it an O. He stated clearly that it is somewhere in between these two sounds. And he also stated that it is not the way most Jews, even in his day, were pronouncing it. The pronunciation, therefore, of this vowel is not A and not O, but A. I will repeat those three vowel sounds now, one after the other, starting from the Pathach and moving up to the Holim. And I think you will detect quite clearly the difference. The progression is Pathach, Kamatz, and then Holim. So it is A, O. I repeat, A, O. This middle vowel sound, the A sound, is in fact the traditional pronunciation of the Kamatz by the Jews from Bukhara. Bukhara is an area in Uzbekistan. Similarly, the Jews of Afghanistan, which, by the way, and this has a lot to do with this topic, with this subject, the pronunciation of the name of the country, Afghanistan, in the language of the natives of Afghanistan is Afghanistan. And that R sound, that stan, R, is exactly the sound that we're referring to. So the Jews of Afghanistan and the Jews of Bukhara in Uzbekistan and the Jews of, or many of the Jews in Persia, in Paras, have always traditionally pronounced the Kamatz in this fashion. And this is also a very common vowel sound in the language of the Persians, of the Iranians today, Farsi, the R sound. If you run into an old-timer, so to speak, from Persia, from Iran, and you ask him where he's from, he will not tell you he is from Paras, nor, which would be a Sfaradi pronunciation, Paras, where the Kamatz is pronounced like a patach, nor will he say that he is from Poros, which would be the Ashkenazi or Temani pronunciation of the Kamatz, because they pronounce the Kamatz as an O, exactly like the Holem. The correct pronunciation is therefore neither A nor O, but in the middle, A. And that A sound can be heard both amongst those communities that I mentioned, that is to say, Jews from Persia, Bukhara, Afghanistan, and also some of the Ashkenazi Jews pronounce the Kamatz in that fashion. They do not pronounce it as an O, but as an A. And one can also hear it in English, in many dialects of English. For example, a native of New York will not pronounce the word father as I do, father. He will say father, father. And R, that R sound of the A, the way he pronounces the A in the word father is exactly the sound of the Kamatz, which is an R and not an O and not an A. That is the correct pronunciation of the Kamatz, as stated explicitly, plainly, by Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, and as the tradition of a number of ancient, these are actually very ancient Jewish communities, in all these cases, the Jews of Paras, of Persia, one of the very most ancient Jewish communities in the world outside of Israel, going back 2,500 years. The same is true for the Jews of Bukhara, Uzbekistan, and the Jews of Afghanistan. These are very ancient communities that were also somewhat isolated, and therefore they were not really influenced by outside influences from other Jewish communities in other parts of the world, and they retained this very correct pronunciation. In addition, we should mention here the Shadal, the great Hacham Shmuel David Lusato from Italy in the 19th century, according to the Christian calendar. He was a tremendous Hacham and very original and independent thinker who, when he put his mind to something, and he put his mind to many things, he got to the bottom of those things, almost, I would say, without fail. Extremely impressive and extremely insightful and extremely erudite. The Shadal was an expert in Hebrew grammar, one of the greatest, I would say, of all time. And we have a letter from him in his collected letters in volume 9. This is on page, the letter begins on page 1324 in this volume. This letter was written to someone he knew and who asked him questions regarding these issues on Kaf Zayin Shevat Tau Resh Yod Heth. The Gregorian date is the 11th of February 1858. And he explains his position that, first of all, and this is the ancient position as expressed by the earliest of the grammarians whose works have reached us, namely the famous Aharon ben Asher, who writes explicitly that there are 7 vowels in the Hebrew language. This is not the claim that some Medaktakim later came up with, that is to say that there were actually 10, 5 large and 5 small, or 5 major and 5 minor vowels. That classification is actually somewhat spurious. He goes on to show, Shadal in this letter, the original claim by all the early ancient grammarians and experts was that there are seven vowels in the Hebrew language, and these words, these vowels, are contained in the two words Vayomer Eliyahu. In other words, you have the wa, the patach under the waw, and the Vayomer you have the holim over the yod, the wayo, and you have the serol, or as Rashi and Ibn Ezra would call it patach katan, the serol under the mem, and that's Vayomer, and then you have the Eliyahu, you have the sereh under the aleph, the Kamatz under the lamed, and you under the yod, I should say. You have the hirek under the lamed, the Eli, and then you have the yod which has a Kamatz under it, the Eliyah, and the hu, which is the malafum or the shuruk, etc. Those are the seven vowel sounds which can be summarized and remembered by those two words, Vayomer Eliyahu. Shadal points out that clearly Balei Masorah, the people who, the Chachamim, going back something like 1300 years, 1200 years ago, these Chachamim who developed the system, the graphic representation of the correct pronunciation of the Hebrew language, of Lashon HaKodesh, they represented each vowel sound with a specific symbol, as we know. If there was a difference, he goes on to explain, if there is a difference between one sound and another, this is represented by a different symbol. It cannot therefore be, for example, that the Kamatz and the patah have the same pronunciation, because they are represented by different symbols. Similarly, he points out the idea that it was always the case that there were two kinds of Kamatz, what's called a Kamatz Rahav and a Kamatz Hatuf, or a Kamatz Gadol and a Kamatz Katan, one which is pronounced A and the other pronounced O. He said this is clearly incorrect, first of all, because if there were these two kinds of vowels, they would have been represented, which are different from one another, they would have been represented by two different symbols, and that is not the case. All the Kametzim, every Kametz has the same graphic symbol representing it, the shape that we described before. On this basis, Shadal explains that there is in fact, and he's not alone, the concept of a Kamatz Gadol, a Kamatz Katan, etc., was not known by the very early ancient grammarians that we mentioned before. This was something developed by the Kimchi family, in actual fact, by Rabbi Yosef Kimchi, the father of the Radak, and the Radak followed in his footsteps, and this became the common wisdom amongst all Medaktikim. But in fact there is no true basis for this classification, and for the claim that there are 10 vowel sounds, that is to say 5, each of which has a major and a minor form. The truth of the matter is that whether a vowel is major or minor, whether it is stressed or not stressed, etc., depends on its position in the word. It depends on the ta'am, the cantillation mark. It depends on a number, on whether there's a ma'amid, the gaya, or a mether under that letter. There are all kinds of reasons and formats which determine the pronunciation of the vowel in any particular word. But there are only 7 vowel sounds, and that is why we have only those 7 vowel symbols. The 3 dots, the 3 diagonal dots of the qubus is just another representation of the shuruk without the waw, without the letter waw. It is not a different vowel sound. Just as a hirek followed by a yod or not followed by a yod is the same sound. How it's pronounced in any given word, as we said, depends on a number of factors. So, to return to the point at hand, Shadal explains, and this is a very powerful and I think incontrovertible claim, if there was supposed to be a difference between a Kamatz Gadol and a Kamatz Katan, or a Hav and a Hatuf, then there would be a different symbol representing these two chamesim, and that's not the case. In other words, he says we must conclude, and this is what we also understood from the words of Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, and this is what we understood from the words of Rabbi Aharon ben Asher in his book on Dikduk, which is the earliest book we have on the subject. There is only one kind of chames. That is to say, all chamesim really were initially, the intention was they should be pronounced as ah, not or, but ah, and not ah, but in between those two sounds. All chamesim. The thing is that sometimes a chames is in place of a patach for reasons that we won't go into here, and other times a chames is in place of an holem, of an o sound. So those Jews, now there's another fact that has to be understood here. This pronunciation, this vowel sound, the ah sound, was apparently not necessarily something that was easy for all Jews in all communities. Over time, these things, differences in familiarity with different vowel sounds, etc., cause and bring about changes in the way people pronounce their own language even, and what they're able to pronounce. And if they're not familiar with a certain sound, they will lose the ability to pronounce that sound, or that consonant, or that, whether it's a vowel or a consonant. And therefore, some of the Jews, even though the sound is ah, which is, as the Shadal represented, as an o and an a together, some of the Jews tended to pronounce it more like the a, that is to say like an ah, like a patach, and some tended to pronounce it more like the o, that is like the o, which is like the holem. So the Ashkenazim and the Temanim, by and large, pronounced the chames as an o, and the Sfaradim and the Jews in Italy and southern Europe and other parts of the world pronounced the chames as an a, whereas the truth is really somewhere in the middle. Except for the fact that with regards to certain words, it was so obvious and clear that the chames is in place of an o sound, like in the word kol, all, in English, that it was, because you could write kol also kaf waw lamed with a holem, and it's written instead kol. So instead of kol asmuthai, it really should be kol asmuthai. But the Sfaradim, who pronounce the chames usually as an a, in such cases would pronounce it as an o, as a holem. But in actual fact, there is only one symbol representing every chames in the Tanakh, in our language, and that one symbol represents one vowel sound, which is in between the a and the o, and that is to say it is an a. So every chames should be pronounced as in the word baruch, for example, not baruch and not baruch, but baruch. And that is the correct pronunciation, without a doubt, of the chames. It is clear that this discussion is a little bit involved and a little bit technical, and it is not a simple thing to achieve absolute clarity on the subject. The Shadal says of himself that it took him 40 years of study and research and checking and rechecking all the facts and all the different grammatical rules and statements by different grammarians over the ages to reach this conclusion. But this conclusion is the inescapable and clear-cut conclusion.
The production of these videos and maintaining this channel demands much time and money. If you enjoyed this video, please show your appreciation and support. To make a donation, please go to www.machonshilo.org and press the PayPal button, which appears on the upper right-hand side of the home page. To sponsor a video or purchase Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please write us at office@machonshilo.org.